Today's topic is titled Carbon Capture in Minnesota, Public Lands, Fast Money, and Pipe Dreams with Hudson Kingston, environmental attorney with CURE, a nonprofit focused on moving people to action in rural communities. This presentation will cover the currently proposed carbon capture projects and research that are ongoing in Minnesota. From the cornfields of the agricultural region to the stony landscape of our boreal forests, Minnesota's landscapes are being sized up for a new industrial build-out with different technologies on different timelines and differing potential impacts. There are several different technologies that are on different timelines and have different impacts, but there are some unifying issues about how to think about this new big industry and whether it harms or helps people and the environment. Hudson Kingston has a JD from the University of Iowa, an LLM degree from NYU, and another LLM from the University of Singapore. He's been working in environmental law, public health law, and consumer protection law for more than a decade. Before becoming the legal director of CURE, he worked at national and state-based nonprofits and even spent some time working in a small backwater of the White House. He lives in Ely with his partner and their large cohort of fuzzy pets. Hudson, the floor is yours.
All right. Thank you so much for the introduction, Suzanne. Thank you, everyone, for having me here this month, and it's great to see folks I recognize and know in attendance. So thanks everyone for coming. As Suzanne was saying, the topic is carbon capture in Minnesota, public lands, fast money, and pipe dreams. This is a vast topic. So the only way to narrow it down a little bit is to talk about what's going on in the state of Minnesota. I will try to be somewhat comprehensive, but it is a vast topic. So I had to leave some stuff out. CURE, if you're not familiar with us, we've existed for about 30 years, and our origin is in clean water in the southwest part of the state. We are a rural environmental organization focusing on energy democracy and community resilience. I like to think of it as the nonprofit formerly known as Clean Up the River Environment. We still do work on clean water things, of course, but we have a very big focus on energy projects and clean energy. So we are now go by CURE rather than the full longer name. I'm going to try to cover a lot in our short time together today, and we'll see how far we can get in this. First, I'd like to talk about what do we even mean by carbon capture and sequestration. Then I'll be moving on to what some of the proposed for new technology in Minnesota are, and these are funded through your tax dollars through the Department of Energy grants. Then I will be talking about what the proposal of the oil and pipeline industry is in this space, which we are funding with our taxpayer dollars through clean fuel standard incentives. That will also overlap a bit with a proposal by the U.S. Forest Service, which I will mention and discuss a bit, to open up our national forests to this industry. Then finally, we'll bring it back to Aiken County and Talon to talk about what the mining industry is working on in this space, the funding that we're providing them as taxpayers through the Department of Energy, and also how this might be impacted by the Forest Service's proposal to open up its lands to carbon capture and sequestration. Hopefully we can get through all of that. Okay, what is carbon capture and sequestration? It is many things to many people. First of all, on the moral upstanding side, a lot of people view it as a useful or even necessary climate change mitigation technique. Capturing CO2 emissions from burning things, either directly from a pollution source's smokestack or from the atmosphere itself, and converting it into another form of carbon to store it outside of the atmosphere is what the general term carbon capture means, and that's what sequestration is as well. You're taking carbon out of air emissions, out of the ambient air, and you are turning it into a rock, you are turning it into a liquid, you are turning it into a concentrated gas and trying to find a place to stick it so that it doesn't come back into the atmosphere. Because as you all may know, we put entirely too much carbon in the atmosphere already, and it's a huge problem. To the bullets I have here, trees already do this for free. So, if you're against all carbon capture and sequestration, I'm sad to say that nature actually does it quite well. So there's a certain amount of background carbon capture going on at all times, and it's something that we can encourage. Wetlands, more specifically to Aiken County, wetlands are slower at capturing carbon, but they do a much better job than trees do. They store thousands and thousands of years of captured carbon as opposed to hundreds and hundreds of years, as you can see in this white pine. So don't count any wetlands out when you're thinking about this. And the last one is a rhetorical question. Do we think that humans can do better than natural carbon sequestration? And for a lot of people, the answer is yes. So to other people, what is carbon capture and sequestration? It means money, and a lot of it. We will be talking about direct grants that these companies are getting from the federal government and the investment from private equity and the tech industry. We'll be talking about tax incentives, which we've had since 2008, that have also been recently increased for burying tons of CO2 deep underground. They pay a certain amount of money for pushing carbon underground to get oil out, or what's called enhanced oil recovery. They pay a little bit more to store CO2 from smokestacks and not get oil out. And then they pay even more to push the carbon underground if it has not been captured from a smokestack, but instead has been captured from the ambient air. So this gets very complicated very fast, but let's just say it's a lot of money on a per ton basis to push carbon deep underground. And then also there's, that was federal incentives. There are also state incentives like California's low carbon fuel standard, which has been adopted by other states as well. That is a big boost for this industry and allows them to access money that they wouldn't otherwise get. And then even without our taxpayer funded incentives, private companies, when they say that they are net zero, they mean that they are buying carbon credits from other companies that are claiming to capture the carbon. So that money is coming from big companies whose services you use, their money is money they got from you. That is a major funding source for this new industry. And then finally, for a lot of people, carbon capture and sequestration, as it's currently proposed in practice today, is a false climate solution. That is to say that if you do carbon capture wrong, like doing too much of it on the wrong industries instead of just cleaning up or getting rid of those industries, this technology will take all of our financial resources and all of our time and not actually do anything to stop climate change. Most carbon capture projects proposed right now are meant to keep running heavy polluting industry where there are better options. So for example, instead of putting carbon capture on a coal plant, close the coal plant. Instead of putting carbon capture on ethanol, move towards electric transportation and mass transit. So a lot of these projects are proposed by very big incumbent industries in order to keep themselves running as they have. And we simply don't have enough money or time to waste on doing that. So I'm going to cover 3 things that are happening in Minnesota, broadly speaking. First, fun little startups that are trying to come up with new ways to capture carbon. The current biggest industry proposal, which is from the oil and gas industry and friends. And then finally, industry research, which is where I'll be able to talk a little bit about Talon's funding and efforts here. Currently in Minnesota, there are startups and companies that are trying their darndest to figure out new ways to get carbon out of the air and put it into other stuff. So for example, the Department of Energy recently has announced that it's funding this company in Northfield to remove CO2 through enhanced carbon mineralization of steel slag aggregates in gravel roads. It'll be 8,108 carbon dioxide removal credits to DOE over the prize period. So a few things to note there. Steel slag aggregates, we're not talking about happy-go-lucky, people in their driveways and garages coming up with ways to just innocuously do this. They are working with heavy industry. They are working with sometimes toxic technologies that maybe this will capture carbon, but when you're dealing with heavy metals and other things like that, you have to watch out for the fact that one person's carbon capture might be another person's water pollution. This one relies on steel slag aggregates. in gravel roads. I mean, as a rural Minnesotan, I'll let you know, we don't have unlimited gravel roads. And the fact that they are giving them 8,000 carbon dioxide removal credits, it doesn't say this here, but I assume that that means 8,000 tons of CO2, which sounds like a lot. But when you're comparing it to the scale of the problem, it's a good start for research, and it's not necessarily a technology that will scale. Another example of this is a recent article about the biochar king of Minneapolis. So Minneapolis, the city, is investing in this idea of biochar, which is taking carbon that's been captured by trees, by wood, and then converting it into a low value type of coal. So you burn it in a specific way and you create biochar, which is more stable than just allowing wood to rot or something like that. If you want to fall down a rabbit hole, go read about biochar. It's apparently going to save everyone from everything, and it's a hell of a technology, but it doesn't really capture very much carbon. So from this article, the climate benefits will be likely to be minimal. The city couldn't provide me with an estimate, but a story about the project from last year noted that the city anticipated having a system that could handle 3,600 tons of wood waste per year, resulting in an estimated 1,500 tons of CO2 removed. That's about 0.04 of the city's current annual emissions. So 1,500 tons sounds cool, but you got to compare it against a baseline. And so I'm not saying that biochar is pointless. I'm just saying it's not much of a carbon capture solution. And I am happy to discuss this with you at a later date. So what is proposed by the industry, on the other hand, is gigantic. And it is a known technology we've been doing since at least the 1980s. And this fun little graphic, which I did not make, sort of explains it. So the idea is you go to places that have smokestacks, either places that are burning natural gas, or they're creating hydrogen and that has CO2 as a byproduct, or they want to burn coal, like there's a lot of plants that want to put this technology on coal. And they create a lot of pipelines, and they take those pipelines and they shoot that compressed CO2 underground in a place where it's possible to do that. This, as I said, is a proven technology. We've been doing it since at least the 1980s. And you might wonder, why haven't I heard of this, Hudson? It's a weird thing that we've been doing this and nobody's talked about it really. Well, we've been doing it, as many people may know, to extract more oil. So this has not been developed because the pipeline and oil industry are great people who like to save the environment. In fact, it's to produce oil out of oil fields that have run dry. By pushing in a lot of CO2, you can get out a lot more barrels of oil. And this is a proven technology that many geologists have devoted their entire careers to. And we know that it works very well for extracting oil. It's less clear that it works very well for permanent carbon storage, but we do know that a bunch of pipes with a bunch of compressed CO2 can certainly push a ton of, or a large amount, ton is a underestimate in this case, of stuff into the ground. So they know it'll work, and that's what they'd like to do here in Minnesota. So this is the current pipeline network that's proposed by the Summit Carbon Solutions company. They've never built a pipeline before. They're just this new fangled concept to create the largest CO2 pipeline network in the world, and that includes parts of Minnesota. You can see that the end of the road is in North Dakota there, next to the North Dakota oil patch. They currently have said to some people that they intend to permanently sequester it without extracting oil, and they've said to other people that they would certainly bring CO2 to North Dakota to extract more oil. So it depends on whether you believe them on Monday or Tuesday, because they've said both to different audiences. Also, and I think important to our public lands point, I've recently learned from the USFS, National Forest folks, that there has been an application in North Dakota to inject carbon dioxide into the Dakota Prairie National Grassland, which is also close to the oil patch. So this is going to be injected potentially under privately held lands, but also potentially under publicly held lands, especially if the Forest Service changes their policy to allow it. Currently, it is not allowed, but they have a rule that they proposed which would change that. Interestingly, Minnesota, you can see from this map, is sort of an afterthought. The real action is in Iowa and South Dakota, and necessarily in North Dakota. But keep in mind, this is just the initial proposal by the company to hook up to some ethanol plants. It is not what the eventual build out of this network could be. And for that, this is a general geology map from our friends at the U.S. Geological Survey. And you'll see on the left half of North Dakota, there's that gray spot that is where one could inject CO2 underground. But if you were wondering, can they do that here in Minnesota? No. We do not have the right geology. So this technology that the oil and gas industry likes requires pipelines that would take CO2 out of Minnesota and bring it somewhere else. Presumably North Dakota, Illinois, or Michigan are the closest ones that it could go to. And that's ignoring Canada. Of course, Canada would be a huge receiver of CO2 if we let them. They have lots of oil to get out. So the green marks on our great state of Minnesota there, we'll get to that at a later section, but right now it's just useful to know that Minnesota cannot use the type of CO2 that the oil and gas industry wants to inject underground. It cannot be injected in Minnesota because we don't have oil and gas deposits the same as these other states. Two photos ago, there was just the beginning of the Summit Carbon Solutions pipeline network. This is the existing, a simplified version of the existing pipeline network that crosses Minnesota and the rest of the country. You can see we have a lot of pipelines in Minnesota, and once you start building a pipeline network, it doesn't just stop there. It continues to grow. And we can expect that where there are pipelines, they would put a second pipeline, a third pipeline, a seventh or a 10th pipeline next to that in a corridor. Where could this potential pipeline network build out? Again, ignore the green for now, but all of these dots are existing industrial heavy sources of CO2 pollution in our area. And I've added question marks up around Superior, Wisconsin and down in southwest Minnesota, because both in Superior and in southwest Minnesota, our energy companies have proposed gigantic new gas-fired power plants. And you can't build a new gas-fired power plant without seriously considering having carbon capture on it, because the US EPA under the current administration is pretty clear that they are going to require things like 90% carbon capture on gas plants. So if you're going to build a new one, it's going to have two pipelines, one to bring the gas to it and one to take away the CO2. And currently the Summit Pipeline Network doesn't say it's going to connect to those facilities because they don't exist yet. But I mean, if you build it, they will come, is my take on that. Sorry for the busy map, but the dots are everywhere on Minnesota, and they indicate places where a build out may be likely. And then no dots on this one, but this is where our federal public lands and federal Indian reservations are in Minnesota. Most of them are in northern Minnesota. Aiken County and where I live up in Ely are much closer to the federal Indian lands federal public lands that we have, and also the reservations. And as a result, we know a little bit more. We have a little more experience with pipelines and industry crossing these public lands. Obviously, the rest of Minnesota has state public lands. This is just a map of the federal public lands. But because the the Forest Service, which administers these two green areas, has a current proposal to allow carbon capture companies to use their lands permanently, to put on pipelines permanently through national forests, it is relevant here to us, even though currently the Summit Pipeline is not proposed in the northern part of the state. And folks in Aiken County would know this is a photo of Line 3, its previous route, and the new route for the brand new Line 3 pipeline. On that black line, you can see that was 6 active pipelines. Now it is 5 active pipelines in an abandoned pipeline. The brown line is the new Line 3 route, which has 1 active pipeline, but very soon it could have 6 active pipelines, because when you build 1 pipeline, you create a corridor. Interestingly, I'm just talking about oil and gas pipelines for now, but the same company, Enbridge, who built Line 3, is very bullish about being the pipeline company for the carbon capture industry as well. They have plenty of information about how they want to get into this, and you can bet that if they already have a pipeline corridor, they will use their existing corridor to build more pipelines. This is where I just mentioned in passing, a CO2 pipeline is very similar to an oil pipeline in that it has the same impacts on groundwater, it has the same impacts on land. It really can negatively impact those things, but it's different as well because the pressure of a carbon dioxide pipeline is so much more than even a natural gas pipeline that it can act in very strange ways. And when it explodes, it can cause pretty remarkable harm to human health and the environment through the off-gassing of large amounts of CO2 displacing air and causing, suffocation on large landscape scales. As far as that proposal goes for the Summit Pipeline, this fall will be your opportunity to get involved if you so choose. There are public meetings on August 20th and 21st, and you can comment through September 11th in the proposed docket for the Summit Pipeline before the Public Utilities Commission right now. We are happy to share information with you about that. We'll be organizing folks in person and online and would love to keep you in the loop. So please reach out to me or get hooked up with Cure if you're interested in what the oil and gas industry is proposing for our state. Industry research, this is where we get to talk about Talon a little bit more specifically. So as I said, you were supposed to ignore the green for now, but now let's look at the green. Green here is, I'm going to say this wrong, I always do, mafic rocks, and the orange dots are ultramafic rocks. I am a lawyer, not a geologist, but these are rocks that the U.S. Geological Survey has identified as being useful for carbon capture and sequestration because when they are weathered, they capture CO2 from the atmosphere and convert it to basically dirty water with higher amounts of carbon in it. So these are the potential places where this type of carbon capture could happen in our area. As you can see, it's very similar, not exactly the same, but similar to our public lands and where tribal areas are. So if you thought that was a coincidence, I don't think it's a coincidence, or at least I'm concerned about the opening of our public lands up to a new heavy industry, especially our lands that are either set aside as wilderness and meant to be protected, or lands that tribes have every right to co-manage, and giving up these lands to a new industry permanently, as the Forest Service seems to be interested in doing, would cut off tribes from their historic and legal rights to manage these lands, which are only starting to become a thing here in Minnesota. There is one orange dot that those in Aiken County may have noticed on that. It's X'd in this slide, and that's where Talon Metals is. Talon Metals is in the carbon capture game. They're not yet a mining company. That is to say they haven't done any mining, but they are getting money from both the government and their mining sugar daddy to research the possibility of using Minnesota minerals for carbon capture. So they received $2.2 million from the Department of Energy to look at doing a new kind of carbon capture. And Rio Tinto has put in $4 million. And this is a 3-year process where they're doing lab studies, field work. Many thanks to Tom Anderson for the information on this. It's a big, complicated thing hard to keep track of, and I appreciate the help. This type of rock weathering has been done, and Tom did a great presentation on this topic already, so I won't repeat it, but it's being done in Iceland with very large industrial facilities on the landscape in areas that don't have trees and don't really have a whole lot of wildlife. So consider whether what they do in Iceland is exactly what we should do in the north half of the state of Minnesota. I don't know if it is the same thing we should do. And then the same thing, one interesting thing is like what they're doing in Iceland is not what they're doing in Albania, but they're both doing weathering to do carbon capture and sequestration. So this is a company that I just heard about yesterday or 2 days ago called Metal Plant in Albania. And it has a novel technology combining nickel mining with enhanced rock weathering to produce nickel and CDR. And I think this is interesting to this group particularly. What they're doing is they are farming flowers that naturally uptake a large amount of nickel, and they are drying out those flowers and then using that as a mine. Now, what else they're doing is they're grinding up this type of rock and putting it on their fields so that it can capture CO2, but also it discharges toxic amounts of nickel as a result of doing that. So they are putting the specific type of rock that we also have in Minnesota to some extent on fields. They're soaking it up and they're extracting it without having a mining pit. But they do end up with land pollution in terms of additional nickel, which the flowers are helping them take off. And then, as I said, my understanding as a lawyer, not a geologist, is that the carbon that's captured goes into runoff water. So that ends up, increasing the carbonic acid, if you will, in runoff water, which is, to some extent, there is carbon in water, but I question whether you want to have an extremely high amount of that in the water running off of your farm field. But it's just a different way of doing it. And weatherization, there's probably hundreds of companies working on different ways to do it. I don't know what Talon Metals has planned, but this is one example of people trying to do it one way. And I'm sure we'll see a different kind of way from our friends at Talon. So I think I maybe have one more slide. So just in conclusion, I want to bring you back to the idea that trees do this already and for free. Wetlands do carbon capture. And when we are talking about draining a wetland or cutting down a forest in order to do carbon capture, I think we should think long and hard about whether that's a good idea, because we are already getting ecosystem services from our natural landscapes, and we could do more to help those landscapes to stay healthy and to capture carbon on their own. Or we could cut them up with pipelines, and we could cut down trees, and we could do all these things in order to make some incumbent industries richer with our own taxpayer dollars. Those are it's sort of not as simple as just that dualism, but often it is coming down to that. So the use of national forests for carbon capture industry will require pipeline right-of-ways where there will be no trees. That will fragment habitat. That will have impacts on those who already use these areas. It will negatively impact the logging industry, our good friends at the logging industry. So everything here is a trade-off, and we need to think about what our values are and what we want to spend our time and money on in terms of actually addressing climate problems with actual solutions. And yeah, if we have time, I think that's my whole presentation. So I will start looking at the chat, but I don't know, Suzanne, if people normally unmute and just ask questions, whatever you guys want to do.
Yeah, I was looking at the chat. If people want to unmute and ask questions, go ahead. There was a little bit of discussion about a carbon capture project in the United Arab Emirates. From Josh, if you want to be more specific, Josh. Some conversation about impact on wetlands and waterways.
Yeah, does anyone want to ask a question or make a statement? Just feel free to put up your hand so we know who wants to. Go ahead, Tom.
I was wondering if there was any work that you were aware of, Hudson, to determine where we might be reforesting in Minnesota for carbon capture.
Yeah, it's a good question. Thank you. So there's two different ways of looking at this. There's the proposal from a couple of years ago to plant 1 trillion trees on every patch of land available. That has been widely viewed by academics to be a silly idea that wasn't going to work because it required taking places like natural grasslands and agricultural lands and places where people live and put a bunch of trees there, which generally speaking, when you just plant trees, they tend to die. The research I'm aware of from a friend of mine who works at the University of Minnesota Forestry School is that by creating conditions for healthy forests, they absorb significantly more carbon than they would otherwise do. So a healthy Minnesota forest is, without using any more acres, is going to capture significantly more carbon. And then if you look at, when I visited the Tamarack area, those trees right in front of Talon, that's a plantation. It's only one kind of pine tree that's grown like corn in rows. That's not healthy. That's not good habitat for animals, but it also doesn't really capture any carbon. So I think converting our plantation forests back to healthy natural forest would be the easiest way to deal with this. And it would mean that we produce slightly less paper in the state of Minnesota, but our carbon capture increases would be significant. So I don't think that we need to take more acres. We just need to manage our acres better. I see other Tom also has his hand up. Go for it, Tom.
Yeah, I was a lobbyist an environmental lobbyist in Kansas about 15 years ago before I moved up here. And I know there's a lot of talk back then in Kansas to take carbon dioxide and to put it in former oil wells that have been capped, or not capped. There's a lot of them not capped. And the problem was reliability. You know, what's the data on being able to hold carbon dioxide in the ground? In this case, you're shipping carbon dioxide to use it for fracking, but fracking is a system of cracking the rock basically and forcing out the petroleum product that's in it. And I'm going, well, how is the carbon dioxide going to be kept in those areas where you're forcing it into? Is there data on that? That never made sense to me at all.
Yeah, that's a great question. So,
I mean, you're doing this in the same place. You're sending the carbon dioxide.
Yeah. So most of the industry's experience is with extracting oil. And they don't care if it comes out, you know, they don't care if the CO2 comes out. So it gets injected. In that case, it's still quite deep, but it's less deep than the other kind. So a class 2 well goes down for EOR, and they're supposed to cap those wells when they finish using them, and they're supposed to monitor it for a few years. But we're talking about tens of years, not hundreds of years. So their primary goal is to get more oil out, not to create permanent storage. For a class 6 well, which would get more money for a tax credit, they do have to inject more deeply. They have to inject, usually they're going into a saline aquifer, so they're trying to combine this ultra pressurized, extremely cold CO2 with water underground and have that dissipate through the water. And you know, if you talk to a geologist who does this for a living, on paper, they can be pretty sure that it will stay underground. But as I think you know, Tom, because you were working on this, you are trusting the oil and gas industry to do it. So the geologist will write down how to do it, but then you have to have that implemented by a subcontractor of a subcontractor of a subcontractor who is in charge of capping that well. And we are trusting them to not put too much in, to not put it in too quickly, and also to do a bang-up job of mixing the concrete to cap that well. And I've talked to people who are more familiar with the North Dakota oil industry than I am, who said you really can't trust those subcontractors to mix the concrete correctly. So, I mean, that's an anecdotal example, but when I hear that, I think, well, you know, the fact that it works on paper doesn't mean that it works in practice, and I do have concerns about that. We have some great questions. Tess's question, what are the gas plant proposals for Southwest Minnesota and what stage are they at? Xcel Energy has proposed 2 new giant gas plants in their integrated resource plan. You have the opportunity this summer to comment on that plan. They are saying that in order to do a transmission line from Southwest Minnesota to the middle of the state to carry wind energy, they need to have gas backup. I am not an expert on Xcel's IRP docket, but I seriously question whether they actually need a gas backup or whether that would just be the thing that makes them the most money. But yes, there's an open comment opportunity there, Tess, if you'd like to. What is the info about carbon capture pipelines, ruptures, and size magnitude of the devastation of rupture? Hayes also says, curious about this too, and you can maybe describe how CO2 is actually pressurized to transport in pipelines similar to natural gas, or what's the nature of gas when it's moving through the pipe? This is a wonderful scientific question, which I will try to answer, but again, I'm a lawyer, not a scientist. So a natural gas pipeline is pressurized around 200, 300 psi. A CO2 pipeline is going to be pressurized way above 1,000 psi. And they keep the CO2 in a high pressure, low temperature state such that it could turn into a liquid, it could be a gas, or it could be a supercritical fluid. So it's traveling through this pipeline at very high pressures. And if there is any sort of pinhole leak or large, explosive fracture in the pipeline, it will come out from the pipeline at that super high pressure, and a small amount of it will solidify into dry ice, and a very large amount of it will turn into a gas cloud. When it converts from supercritical to gas, it becomes extremely cold, which means that the pipeline at the rupture point is going to freeze solid and rip farther. In most cases, there are pinhole leaks in these pipelines, but often it's a catastrophic failure. In, I believe, 2020 in Sotarsha, Mississippi, about 50 people had to go to the hospital because there was one of these explosions. It happened at night, and they were lucky that particular CO2 pipeline had a bad smell to it. Normally, the CO2 that would be carried in these pipelines doesn't have that sort of adulterant, and therefore you wouldn't even know that you're being poisoned. Nobody died in that case, but the people who went to the hospital, many of them have chronic disease for up until today, at least. And a lot of people were passed out. A lot of first responders got there and didn't know what was going on, and then their cars stopped working because, of course, if there's no oxygen in the air, if it's just CO2, I'm sorry, there's oxygen in CO2, but if normal air is displaced, an internal combustion engine doesn't work. Yeah, this is the most recent example from a CO2 pipeline, but there was a disaster in the 1980s in Africa where a CO2 bubble from a volcano came out of a lake and killed more than 1,000 people. So we do know that concentrated CO2 coming out of the ground is not fun. And those are the human health impacts, but also, leaking into groundwaters creates carbonic acid. There are some reports of wildlife being killed by pipeline leaks. And we have a more recent experience in Louisiana where a pipe station, an O-ring from a pipe station blew out, I think this last fall, and the entire community had to shelter in place. And they only knew about it because the local volunteer firefighters reported it to the pipeline company. The pipeline company wasn't aware. So again, lawyer, not scientist, but I'm pretty disturbed by the potential negative impact of a failing pipeline. And we all know that, when it goes in the ground, it's new, and then a year later, that pipeline's a year old. The O-ring that blew out in Louisiana, I believe, was about 10 years old. So I mean, maybe it wouldn't pop the next day, but that is the difficulty of having a pipeline, is they're always getting older and they require maintenance. And if they're installed incorrectly in the first place, then there's going to be a lot of leaks.
Hudson, can you speak to conservation easement funding in the works for maintaining mature forests and its alternate role in carbon capture? And realistically, are we looking at that as a feasibility versus building pipelines everywhere and destroying forests?
So you're saying conservation easements
for people maintaining mature forests on private and public land?
Yeah, there's some of that. Really, a lot of the conservation easements that we have now are through the Farm Bill, and therefore farmers to have buffer areas, and not necessarily plant a forest, but to have perhaps perennial crops and locally suited species. So we have a large federal program for that. And then there's private money to get easements on forested land. So, like the Nature Conservancy will pay people to keep land out of agricultural production for periods of time. That's something that's definitely going on in the background, and I think it's very important. And And if you did have that type of easement, I don't think it would be easy to also have a pipeline cut through the same land. But I think there are, concerns that some of these payments, especially the ones through the Farm Bill, are somewhat temporary. So when the price of corn goes really high, farmers will take that land out of the conservation reserve program, and they'll grow corn. And then when the price of corn goes down, you'll have more people going back into the conservation reserve program. And if you're talking about managing these lands to capture carbon, it needs to be a longer term investment. So like the wetlands of Aiken County, could have hundreds or thousands of years of carbon in them. But if you drain it and start mining the peat out of a wetland, you're not going to get that back by, like having it drained 1 year and then have the water come back. It's unfortunately a very slow process.
Linda is asking if there are there no federal limits on CO2 release from the extraction process? No federal monitoring?
Currently, there is no limit on CO2 pollution that you or I or a company puts up. So the reason that the summit proposal is to take the CO2 from ethanol plants is that the ethanol brewing process, basically they're taking sugary corn water and they're turning it into an alcohol. That produces a huge amount of pure CO2 because when you brew any sort of alcohol, the yeast is burping out CO2 the whole time. And yeah, that is not regulated by the EPA. At the same ethanol plant, they do have an air permit for the burning they do, from their smokestack emissions. But ethanol plants have really large CO2 emissions that are totally off the books in that they are coming from the actual fermentation of the corn that's used to make ethanol. And yeah, generally speaking, our regulators have identified CO2 to be a big problem for climate change, but we are only at the beginning stages of having any limits on CO2 emissions. So the EPA has proposed power plant standards for coal and gas plants that would require them to limit their CO2 emissions. But that's just a rule that's recently been finalized, and it won't start actually limiting those emissions for a few years yet. And ultimately, it may mean that these plants close instead of adding carbon capture. It's yet to be seen what they decide is most cost effective. Yeah, Tess, thanks for the question. What's the latest on the Forest Service process to consider CCS on federal lands? Recently, this last week, they had said that they were going to publish the rule this past spring, and they have not done so, but they currently plan to publish it in December, so right after the election. And this is a draft rule where they basically said that the oil and gas version of CCS that I described would be okay to do on national forest lands. So in the Superior National Forest, the Chippewa National Forest, or anywhere in the country on a national forest or grassland, they would now allow the permanent use of those lands for carbon capture sequestration, for pipelines, for injection, for carbon capture. So that was the proposal, and we did submit very negative comments about how we thought that was illegal and wrong in early January. And we haven't, the main update we have is that they anticipate having their final rule out in December. What they had said back last year when they proposed this was that they recognized they had to consult with tribes about this. And part of our comment was like, yes, you will have to consult with all 580 tribes. So get going on it. And I doubt very much that they have consulted all the tribes by now. And I would be surprised if they could actually do that well by December. So I think that December is a date that's right after the election. So it's a convenient placeholder for when they think they could finish it. But but yeah, I think they will probably be putting, currently they plan to put out a final rule. They haven't given up on this idea yet. And we anticipate it in December or maybe after that. Okay, Tess, you asked a question about what happened to the low carbon fuel standard process in California earlier this year. I do not know the answer to that one. I don't know if anyone else on here does. I have not tracked the low carbon fuel standard developments in California. I know that in Minnesota, there was an attempt last legislative session to pass a similar law in Minnesota that would heavily have benefited ethanol production. And that did not pass in the last legislative session, but it is something that we can expect is probably going to be proposed in the upcoming legislative session. I know that in California, they are fighting over whether certain agricultural practices should be getting the huge support they're getting from the California system. But unfortunately, I don't know, Tess, what happened recently.
We're getting close to the top of the hour. We have time for one more question.
Wesley's is pretty fun. How does the Supreme Court reversal of the Chevron doctrine impact the project's inability to regulate? The reversal of the Chevron doctrine means that these agencies will have a lot harder time passing rules and in issuing permits for new facilities. So on one side, that's really good for industry because they can sue when they don't get what they want. If they don't get the permit they want, they can sue and they have a better shot now. It also means that people on our side have a better shot of winning. Both sides have a better shot of winning and the government has a better shot of losing. So it's an interesting thing because I'm not saying that it's great that the Chevron doctrine is gone, but when it was first announced when I was 1 year old, environmentalists viewed the Chevron doctrine as a disaster. And in the last 40 years, we've become very happy with it and the way that it has been administered. But back in 1984, we didn't want Chevron to win the case. We didn't want the agency to get deference. And so yeah, the Chevron doctrine being overturned is a new state of affairs, and it will make it hard for the government to do big things, both things that are good for the environment and things that are bad for the environment. I hope that answers the question.
I'm going to pause here and say thank you, Hudson, for all of your information.